Good evening, Facebook. I've got all the sensors in place to be able to make this car run right, and I'm curious how many sensors this thing can get away with before it will not let you update on long-term fuel trims. So CAM RF1 and 2 are the long-term fuel trims, and LAMZ 1 and 2 are the short-term fuel trims. These are pretty huge at the moment. Something's a little off with this car. It's adding 15-16% fuel. A little bit different from side to side as well. I suspect some exhaust leaks. But the long-term fuel trims are not updating. This should go up to try to drive this back down to 0 plus or minus 3%. The fact that these are stuck is because I've got the ACT sensor unplugged. And you can see that in the failed memory flags. This little one right here shows up as flag bit 5. Bit 5 is the ACT flag. That's because I got it in my hand. So this is where it plugs in at. And when I plug this in, I'm going to expect the adaptives to start adapting. It's interesting, it'll go into closed loop, but it won't use the adapters. So I want to run 2 tests. One, plugging this thing in should restore adaptives. And then I want to try killing off the BAP sensor and see if that also prevents this from updating. So let's just see what happens. Okay, now that it's got a good air charge temp sensor, slowly but surely we're going to see these long-term trims start coming down. And there they are. By the way, I have these turned up really fast for you tuner friends of mine. I got this turned up. The adaptive fuel update rate is all ones, which is pretty quick. And this is the speed of what all ones looks like. So it's not exactly super fast, but if we turned it down to the factory thing, it'd be a lot slower than this. So you can see my short-term trims, the LAMZ 1 and 2, are dropping as these gain. Now, let's see what happens if we unplug the BAP. Okay, barometric pressure sensor is unplugged. You'll see I got like 3 or 4 of them here. I'm screwing around with those, learning stuff. But okay, with the BAP sensor unplugged, do we have updates? If these move, then we do. And they are moving. That's interesting. Let's see if it threw the BAP flag. Yes, it did. Bit 1 is thrown. That's the BAP flag, or barometric pressure sensor failed memory effects management flag. In other words, the computer thinks the BAP is bad. So I definitely failed the BAP by unplugging it, which is what I expect. And just for kicks, let's see what the readings are. BAP bar is a rolling average filter, and it's stuck at 30, which is kind of like wherever it left off. BP, the number actually used, is the final number, and it defaults to 27.75 because that's what I set it to in the tune to default to if that sensor's bad, just so I'd recognize that unique number. And then IBAP, my newest parameter, IBAP, says 2775. So isn't it interesting that when we unplug the BAP sensor, the instantaneous BAP reading matches the barometric pressure sensor reading from before, and it's because it just stops updating. Actually, it's more than it just stops updating. That number was never really the BAP number. It was 29 point something. So it actually, instantaneous raw BAP actually fakes it. It's a substituted value that matches BP. So BP tells this what to do for a change. Normally, instantaneous BAP gets filtered a little bit and becomes BAP bar. BAP bar slowly but surely becomes BP if the computer tune says BP is in place, if it hasn't been shut off in the tune or whatever. So it's interesting that BP turned around and told IBAP what to do. So instantaneous BAP isn't really that instantaneous after all, when that's a substituted value. Now if I plug in a bad sensor or something, it'll read whatever the bad sensor really reads. It also does it in pretty real time. So yeah, she's been correcting away, so the computer doesn't care if the BAP sensor is bad. It still allows adaptive learning to take place. And we've pretty much learned all there is to learn now. The short-term trims are bobbling around 2-3%. Exactly what we want to see in closed loop. The long terms have pretty much maxed out what they're going to learn. So this thing's adding 10 to 13% fuel for whatever reason. I suspect it's got a header gasket leak or some really slow O2s that are not helping the situation. And I also noticed earlier, if I unplug the ACT sensor, these numbers freeze, but they don't erase back to zero. That's pretty cool. You guys want to see my data logging? Actually, let me plug this BAP sensor back in. That BAP sensor is a known good, and I got it hooked up to my vacuum gauge, which I haven't currently pumped, but just for kicks I'll do that for you guys. These are the ones you want to keep your eye on. BAP bar, which is a rolling average filter, BP, which is the number the computer actually uses, and IBAP, which is what's actually happening. Notice how fast IBAP is updating just sitting there? That's definitely instantaneous. Now, if I reach over here and give the old vacuum gun a squeeze, watch what happens to IBAP. Also interesting, the idle kicks up. There must be a table that relates BP to idle speed, but I haven't found that in the tune yet. That's kind of interesting. And if I go too far with this and get below 15, which is the bottom of the transfer function, look what happens. It shoots up to the default value. Notice BAP bar stays pegged at 14, the last known value that was reported by the sensor before the sensor went off the range. BP jumps up to the substituted value, and IBAP jumps up to the substituted value. So when I release that vacuum on the vacuum gun, it goes back to a real number. That matches, and that matches. Sorry about the shaky camera, guys. I'm doing this one-handed. I've turned off about 130 PIDs, so we're only looking at the most important ones in my opinion. For you guys that haven't seen this before on my Fox stuff, this is live data from a 1990 Fox body Mustang. It's a Mustang GT automatic, running an A9P processor. And there's some of the live data if you guys want to check it out. I got the timers, time since start, time since the temp reached temp FB, which is a threshold for closed loop. This is my favorite flag, C5. That's the failed memory effects management flags, and shows me which sensors the computer thinks are bad. Right now, none of them. Pigos is the left and right oxygen sensor. To me, they look like they respond a little slow, but not bad considering I haven't replaced them. ACT raw input, that's the actual voltage coming from the air charge temp sensor right now. VAP raw inputs, the actual VAP readings from the barometric pressure sensor. Background counter for IPS, IBR, that's nerdy stuff, don't worry about that. ECT raw input, that's the coolant temp sensor voltage. FREQ, eye frequency. I'm not sure what that is yet. I'm still working on that one. I haven't figured it out, but it updates awfully fast, whatever it is. It looks to me like it's a counter. Maybe a counter that tops out at 128. I'm not sure. IMAF is the instantaneous mass airflow sensor voltage. Idle air integrator. It's pretty cool. It's 0. That's the amount of airflow added or subtracted by the computer to get to the desired idle speed. I haven't messed with the idle that much in this car, but I think I've actually got it pretty solid because that thing is sitting right at 0, so the computer's not adding or subtracting any more than it already learned, but it did already learn some. And this is how much it already learned. ISC cam drive with AC on, neutral and neutral with AC on. These are the 4 cells that holds the adaptive learning for the idle airflow trims. It's like a long-term idle trim, whereas idle air integrator is like a short-term idle trim. The fact that the short terms went to 0 means the long term's already done learning all it can. Right now we would be in, let's see, I think I didn't set that flag, but right now we should be in neutral without the AC on. That appears to be the only one updating, so that's probably true. And there's almost no corrections whatsoever in either the short-term or long-term idle trims, which means idle airflow is spot on this thing when it's warmed up. Which explains why it's behaving perfectly well. It's a pretty much stock motor with a B cam. You guys want to hear it? Sounds a little lumpy to me, but this is like a B cam of Flowmasters and chopped off exhaust at the axle. That's it. One well-behaving B cam. TPS raw input voltage. I always preach to you guys set it around 0.98, and I follow my own advice. There it is. Load sitting around 18-19%. Sounds about right for idle. Here's another parameter I haven't figured out yet. M delta. Time between BP sensor pulses and clock ticks. I guess that's just the frequency coming out of the the amount of time between frequency pulses coming out of the BP sensor, that would be a useless PID. Not very important, other than that it tells me that the frequency is updating. These two are also used in the BAP calculation. I commanded, I think it was 750 idle. Yeah, 752 RPM desired idle. And my actual idle, pretty much right on. This car, Lauren and I stuck some 24-pound Ford Racing injectors in, the AA302s, and there's your pulse width at idle, right about 3 milliseconds. There's Ratch, which is a learned TP position. Here's your spark advance at idle, which is constantly being moved by the spark multiplier at idle. So this increases or decreases spark by this ratio. Get the car to idle great. It looks like it's kind of constantly. This might not be right because it's actually commanding about 20 degrees and getting about 17, 20. This number here might not be dead on. I'll have to look at that a little closer. This one's a dud. I haven't figured that one out yet. That's temperature of the coolant at start, and I clearly don't have it right. Always more to do. TP filter, I haven't figured out what that does either. TPS voltage is rock steady at 0.977, which is amazing considering this piece of junk BBK throttle body had some cheap aftermarket TPS on it. I thought that would be a lot worse than that. Couple of different dashes on this thing. This one's set up to look like a stock box body. Come on, focus. There we go. It's kind of interesting to watch the spark gauge. These bars here and then same on the other side. These are O2 sensor sweeps from lean to rich, so you can actually see in graphic form how fast they switch. And I would say these are stumbly. I think that it probably needs some O2s. This thing's not exactly sweeping away. Probably explains some of the fuel trims too. These O2s are probably super old and never been changed. So Lauren, you can put that on the list of things to do. This one stands for the throttle position. CT is closed throttle, PT is part throttle, and WOT is wide open throttle. It's basically throttle status mode. This light is a closed loop bulb. Turns green and says CL when it's in closed loop. Turns orange and says OL when it's in open loop. This is more of the same. I was fooling around with some different things there to see what I liked. There's something you guys will get horrified by. I have that ACT sensor just plugged in but not screwed into the intake manifold and just sitting like by the injectors, and look how hot the air charge temp is sitting here at idle. But fear not, you start moving down the road, that quickly changes when the thing's actually plugged in. ECT 156, this thing's been idling for like 20 minutes at 140, 150. So Lauren, you can add a thermostat to the things that we need to do to this car, because it's clearly not got one in it, or maybe a 160 in it. It's not heating up fast at all. Anyway, that's a pretty cool dash, but I don't use it very often. I use this one quite a bit. This one gives me a decent amount of information. Instantaneous load, per load, which is like Ford's version of load, and I usually don't leave that like that in my tunes. This is just a mostly stock tune at the moment. Idle integrator, which is amazingly at 0 and yet functional. Control is the mode that the idle air control motor's in. There's 4 different IAC modes, and if I reach over and crack the throttle, you'll see that mode will change. I can do this without burning myself. So when you rev the motor up, it's going to go into pre-position. And when I let off, it's going to dash pot down, which is like a leaking down of the IAC until it gets into control, which is within 100, 150 RPMs of idle, and then it starts actually using idle air control motor control. That works pretty well. I dig that that's dataloggable like this. Mass air looks about right. About 0.9 pounds a minute with a V-cam. 14 volts, so the ECU is getting a decent voltage supply from the alternator, because that's just about all of it. TP voltage is fluctuating a small amount on me. There's something to be said for that. I think what's going on there is this the AOD TV cable, I think, is binding just a little bit. If I reach over and push on the throttle, that just changed a little bit. So yeah, something's binding there. Something small like that can really throw you for a loop. If that had been binding more than 100th or 200ths of a volt, it probably would have went into like part throttle mode and revved up and idled really high. Let me see if I can catch that a little bit. If I idle it up just a little bit by hand, see how when it gets to part throttle mode, idle kicks way up. Because the IAC's being purposely open. Well, I think that's about it. This thing's wiping the battery out on my phone pretty fast, so just want to show you guys even though the IAT sensor or ACT sensor, the air charge temp sensor, is not actually used for fueling in this car because it's a mass air car, it still actually affects fueling in the sense that it allows or doesn't allow adaptive learning to take place. So one last look at the adaptives. Looks like about 12 to 15% adaptives. 1.0 would be perfect. 0.84 means it's adding about 15%. 0.88 means it's adding about 11%. 4% variance from side to side probably means the O2 sensors are weak, or the header's got a small gasket leak somewhere, and I can hear that. I think it does. All right, guys, have a good night.